We are in middle of the festival of Passover, of Pesach. And as I mentioned last week, this week, there is no Parsha because on Shabbos, where we typically would read from the Torah, the next Parsha in the book of Leviticus, because it is also Pesach, therefore we read a reading that relates to Pesach, and the next week's Parsha is going to be delayed for another week. And therefore this week, there is no Parsha. Incidentally, in the land of Israel, where they only have one day of the festival, therefore the final day of Pesach is Friday, and therefore Shabbos is already not Pesach anymore in Israel. So we're going to have, for the next upcoming couple of months, it's going to be an unusual situation where our friends, our brethren in the land of Israel are going to be 1 week ahead of us in the schedule. They're going to continue. This week is going to be Parshas Achrei Mos, and we're going to get Achrei Mos the following week, and we're going to be off for a week. But I was thinking, we typically like to do a new Parsha podcast every week. There is no Parsha. I could have said we're not doing a Parsha podcast this week, but I figured I would share with you some idea that maybe you'll find to be valuable and interesting. So on Pesach, there are the two bookends of the festival. You have the first 2 days of Pesach, which we have the two Starim, the Seder night, night number 1, number 2, and then you have the other bookend, the end cap of the festival that's going to begin this year on Thursday night. And in the middle, you have the Chol HaMoed, which is, it's like kind of a hybrid where we're allowed to do work, but it's still Passover. We still eat matzah, etc. And there is a tradition, there's a custom that we like to go, have a good time and celebrate. And we're supposed to drink wine and eat meat. And the kids like going on trips. They don't go to school. Yesterday, I took my oldest son, Akiva, for his first driving lesson. I took my car. I said, we're going to go find an empty parking lot, and you're going to learn how to drive. And he's like, great, I got this. I have a little scooter. No big deal. I could drive the car. And he did a pretty good job. He only hit one curb. I'm like, stop, you don't see the curb. And he's like, I tried to stop, but he hit the accelerator. I said, no big deal. Everyone has that experience. Every new driver has that experience. No big deal. I'm happy you had it. That was last night. He made all these right turns and left turns. Did a great job. Today we took him bowling and laser tag. They're having a fantastic time. But yesterday, which is the first day of Chol HaMoed, the 17th day of the month of Nisan, is my grandfather, blessed Mary, his Yahrzeit. My grandfather passed away 17 years ago yesterday on the 17th day of Nisan. And we're told, our sages tell us that on the day of someone's passing, it's an opportunity for them to upgrade. Meaning every year that they are departed from this world, they have the opportunity to be elevated one notch higher in heaven. And therefore there's a custom, a universal, ubiquitous custom, that the entire year after a person passes, their next of kin recite the Kaddish for them. But then every year on the Yahrzeit, on the anniversary of their parting, the children of the deceased, they say Kaddish as well. And there is also a custom to get together and have a celebration and talk about the departed and extol their virtues and their character and their deeds and try to take some lessons from their life and try to emulate, the great giants and the great antecedents of our past. So my parents are in town. They're in Houston for Pesach. So we had the whole family get together. We had some other people from the community join. We had a little celebration, a Yahrzeit celebration in loving memory of my grandfather. And I want to share with you what I prepared for the assembled. When we talk about my grandfather, we're talking about a real giant. And you think about his life's accomplishments, the voluminous writings, just the immense skill and intellect, and a person who's always working on his character, refining, perfecting his character, but also being so prolific in his output, writing all kinds of books that are genre-defining books, but leaving more works in manuscript. He wrote around 20 books in his lifetime, but there are at least 20 more books to be published after his passing. He headed great yeshivos, accomplished tremendous things, and was so immensely talented, not just in matters of Torah, but even in general knowledge, My father was telling us yesterday, he was saying that he had textbooks of medicine and anatomy. And he says once he came home and his stomach was hurting. So his father pointed to his abdomen. Does it hurt here? Does it hurt here? Or does it hurt here? And he said, it hurts here. He says, it hurts here. You have to go to the hospital right now and give us a call. Give us a call before they operate on you. And it turns out he had appendicitis. And indeed, they caught it. But again, his father knew that. How did he know that? He wasn't classically trained in medicine, but he was a polymath. He was a voracious student of knowledge, and he wanted to study the Almighty's world and all the Almighty's wisdom and the Almighty's handiwork. So he was an expert in medicine. In addition, he was a real expert, a world-class expert in psychology and human nature, but also in psychiatry. In fact, we have a little, it's not little, it's a treatise, a magisterial treatise, where he titled it Psychiatry and Religion. And it's an immense work of tremendous scope and breadth and depth about Torah and Torah philosophy and how it relates to psychiatry. He was also a tremendous linguist. He was fluent in 9 languages. What are those languages? Of course, his native German. He, in fact, wrote a book in German at the age of 16. But of course, he spoke Yiddish, which is like a sister language to German. He had an incredible command. He was a masterclass in Hebrew. His works in Hebrew, even Israelis. He was, of course, German. He emigrated to Israel in 1946. But his Hebrew was on a level that many native Israelis couldn't understand. That's how polished and perfect it was. He had a friend who he only spoke to him in Danish. And then his French son-in-law, he only spoke to him in French. And during the war, 8 years in the war, he was in Sweden and he learned Swedish. And he, in fact, had such a command of that language that he was able to write a book in Swedish that we actually have. We have this book that he wrote in Swedish talking about the principles of Torah and Judaism and why it's important to maintain our fidelity to our religion in Swedish for the Jewish Swedes. But finally, this takes the cake for me. My father was telling us yesterday in high school in Germany, in Berlin, he learned the classics. So he was proficient in Greek and Latin. My father said a story that I never knew before. He said that there were 2 students in his yeshiva in Israel who grew up in non-observant Jewish homes. They grew up non-observant, but then they became more observant to the degree they even went to yeshiva, and they became very close to my grandfather. And their family, was less observant, but when their sister got engaged, my grandfather was participating in the engagement party. And she had studied Latin. She had studied Latin in university or in school. So my grandfather said, I'm going to give a speech in Latin. And he gave a speech that only the bride-to-be understood in Latin. So I'm looking back at my grandfather. I'm like, he's so much more accomplished in every area than me. And it's astonishing that he accomplished so much, even though he was very methodical. One of his hallmarks was doing everything very carefully and mindfully and slowly. You would ask him a question, he would never spit out an answer. He'd always think about it and ruminate upon it and he worked slowly, really. Yet he accomplished so much. So the thought that I had is, how did he accomplish so much? How did he accomplish so much? What was his philosophy on tackling the opportunities and the challenges of life? And I want to suggest maybe a theme that I found in many places in his writing, but also a theme that he exhibited in his work and in his life. And even though, his accomplishments and his talent, I think exceeds the average person by a lot, he was a real genius. He was a genius who deployed all of his energy to accomplish great things, but the format of how he viewed the opportunities in life and the initiatives that we can take in life, his philosophy, I think we could perhaps emulate and adopt it. It could be very helpful for us in our lives. So So I saw an amazing letter that he wrote. This is for someone who was becoming a mashgiach in a high school. Now, what does a mashgiach mean? In the modern yeshiva world, the yeshiva is headed by, it's almost like headed by there's two co-CEOs of the yeshiva. There's the Rosh Yeshiva, who's really like the boss in charge of everything. He gives the Talmud lectures. And then you have the mashgiach, who's like the dean, as it's called. He's more like the spiritual guide for the students. That was the innovation of the Musar movement, where there's not just someone who's there to teach the Talmud and the advanced analytical approach towards Talmud. There's also someone who's there to develop the character of the students and to give them kind of a Musar, ethics, refining character, guiding them to develop themselves into true Torah scholars. So my grandfather was in all the yeshivas that he founded and ran. He was the mashgiach and he was the spiritual dean. And there was a letter that I found where a young budding mashgiach, spiritual dean, was writing to him with his questions and with his dilemmas. So the first part of this letter, I found it to be very interesting. He's explaining what is the primary role of someone who's there in a yeshiva in a capacity as a mashgiach. The foundation of it all is that the children, the students, should have supervision. And then he added, the problems that face the yeshiva world today, they're much stronger lately than they were in the past because there's been an infiltration of the atmosphere, of the spirit of the general world at large that has infiltrated into our world. And therefore, it's much harder to insulate and to protect these young yeshiva students because those influences are infiltrating. And therefore, it's much more difficult, the job you have to do right now, which I found to be very interesting. That's the foundation. You're there to prevent bad, harmful, deleterious influences to corrupt the atmosphere of the yeshiva and of the students. But then he says, he's addressing the person who's writing the letter. He's like, you feel you're not worthy for this task. You know what I want to tell you? I'm also not worthy for my task. At the time he's writing this, he's renowned as one of the great rabbis in the land. And he's been heading yeshiva for decades. And he has written already books that have been widely adopted as foundational works of their kind. But he writes, I'm not worthy for my test. But today, due to the really downtrodden state of the Jewish people, every one of us is in a situation where there's no men, and b'makom she'ein anashim, in this place where there's no men, there's no one to do the job, hishtadel lihios ish, you have to be that person. When there is a degradation of the society, and there's just no one who is up to the task of leading the nation or of leading the yeshiva, you have to step up to the plate. This is based upon a Mishnah in Perkei Avos. The Mishnah tells us, if there's no men, if there's no one there, no one to take responsibility, if there's no leaders to step forward, you have to step up to the plate and you have to be the one to do it. So this is an idea that he's saying that he didn't feel that he was qualified for his position, but he was almost forced into it due to the fact that there's really no one else to do the job. And I sometimes look around at our society and I'm thinking, how many yeshiva students, for example, did they have a leader or an influencer who said, I'm going to take you and I'm going to develop your potential and I'm going to make something out of you. I'll make you a Torah scholar. I'll help you refine your character. I'll really work on molding and crafting you into the best person you could become. I once asked some friends of mine in the yeshiva, I said to them, did you ever have someone like that? Did you have a Rebbe, a teacher, an influence who said, I'm going to make you my project and I'm going to really develop every part of who you are. I'm going to develop all your potential. And they all said no. They were kind of on their own. It's a scary thing. It's a scary thing that there has been a dearth, or a paucity at least, of people who are willing to take responsibility to say, I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to be in charge. Even though I'm not worthy, I'm going to be in charge. I'm going to try to help develop these young people, these young men, into what they can actually become. He claimed he was not worthy for it. He wasn't qualified, but there was just no one else to do the job, and therefore he did it. That's in a letter that he wrote to a young Mashgiach. Now, in the introduction to Alei Shur Volume 2, Alei Shur is considered to be his magnum opus. He wrote Volume 1 in 1966. In the introduction, he says he's been working on the book for 13 years. So he worked on it a long time. And then in 1986, incidentally, the year I was born, he wrote Volume 2. Now, Volume 1 and Volume 2 are very different books. Volume 1 is much more abstract. It's written much more succinctly. It's a very different style. He's expecting more of the reader to understand what he's saying, to put the pieces together, to know how to implement the ideas that he's conveying in the book. Volume 2 is the exact opposite. He actually develops the idea into the most practical component of implementation of his ideas. And therefore, they're very different styles, and people who are familiar with both books, you can tell a lot about a person by asking them which one of these books do they prefer. But in the introduction to Volume 2, he's trying to justify why he wrote such a book. Now, this is a very thick book, and it's enormous in its scope, and he himself defines it as a Shulchan Aruch, which is the name of the book of the Code of Jewish Law. But a Shulchan Aruch means a set table. Everything that you need to know about how to develop your character through the lens of Musar is found in Volume 2 of Alei Shur. And he says, he tries to justify why he wrote it. He says people who are old, the grizzled veterans, the people that had some experience in the rich yeshiva world that preceded World War II. They're going to get to this book, and they're going to open this book, and they're going to say, everything that you're writing over here is so basic and so obvious and so well known. Everyone knows this. There's no reason for you to write it. Moreover, they're going to have a second critique. They're going to say, you took such lofty ideas and you made them so simple and so basic. The people who have had the experience of the pre-war yeshiva world, they're going to have problems with this book. Please, writes the author, my grandfather, judge me favorably. The generation has degraded compared to the generation before the war, and people's capacities and strengths and abilities have been depleted. And therefore, we cannot demand of young students today what was demanded of them then. Moreover, you may think, well, the author himself did not spend so much time in the pre-war yeshiva world. And who knows if he didn't make many mistakes. Nevertheless, I'm going to tell you why I wrote this book. I am a layperson, writes my grandfather, and I'm jumping ahead of the line only because the people who are greater than me did not write this book. Our generation is like an orphan generation, and I am one of the few people that are preserving this method of pedagogy and development of students. And it seems to me that by writing this book, I'm fulfilling what the Mishnah tells us, B'makam she'ein bo anashim, a place where there's no people, hishtadel lios ish. Where there's no people, where there's no leaders, where no one's willing to step up, then it's your job. The Almighty has placed that upon your shoulder. And you know what? Concludes this paragraph. Im shagavata, if you made a mistake, if the author made a mistake, v'hu rachum yechaper avon, God will forgive. Hopefully, please, God will forgive me. My grandfather never felt qualified. He himself was, he arrived in the Mir Yeshiva in 1934. He spent 4 years in the Great Mir Yeshiva before the war. And then he had to leave as a German national. He had to leave Poland, ended up, of course, in Sweden. But 4 years, that's not a comprehensive education. And then he writes this book that covers the entirety. He himself writes that. This is the entirety of the Torah Shebaal Peh, he calls it. There's the Torah Shebachsav, there's the written Torah of the Musar movement, and then there's the oral Torah of the Musar movement. This is the writing down of the Mishnah, the equivalent, so to speak. The writing down, the codification of the corpus of oral Torah of the Musar movement. And I wrote it because there was no one else to do it. And again, I don't feel qualified. I don't feel like I'm the right person to do it. Who knows how many mistakes I did, but no one else did it. So I had to do it. I think that this is an interesting approach for all of us who tend to feel, imposter syndrome. Who are we to do things? Someone has to nominate me. If you see a need, if you see a void, if you see something that's not been taken care of, that is a message from the Almighty. We believe that it's your job to do it, even if you perhaps feel unqualified. I found another letter. These are not well-known letters, where he writes that when his first daughter was born, my grandfather had 3 daughters and then 2 sons. My father's the oldest son. When his eldest daughter was born, she has actually since passed. He says, I was thinking, when a person becomes a father, he feels that the Almighty is giving him something to watch over, something to be a custodian over, something to shepherd, something to be responsible for, and you're responsible for this. This is your mission in life. You have to take care of this child. You have to bear the burden of this child in every situation. This is what the Almighty appointed you to do. When you have a child, that is a vote of confidence from God, where God is extending to you this mission. You're responsible for this child. You have to raise this child. Again, this is similar to the idea that I think it was one of the hallmarks of how he viewed his role in the world. When he was positioned to do a certain job, he, in fact, stood up to the task. So I think that's the first part of how he accomplished all the great things that he did. He had this deep understanding that when the Almighty puts you in a place, in a position, when Almighty positions you to do great things or to undertake great initiatives, that is a vote of confidence from God. You can do it. But secondarily, he also worked really, really hard. I don't know anyone who worked as hard as he did. He was always immersed in thought. Always. He was once by I think it was a bar mitzvah. And whenever he would go to a bar mitzvah, because he was considered to be a very important rabbi, they would tell him to go to the front and to have a seat by the dais. So he was once there, and he was talking to someone else who was like a famous rabbi. And the rabbi confided in him. He says, I don't know what I'm going to do. They just told me that they want me to speak, to give a speech in honor of the bar mitzvah, but I didn't prepare a speech before I came here. So my grandfather was really puzzled by that. He says, I understand. All you need to do is to say out loud what you're thinking in your mind. He always had a speech brewing because his mind was constantly active. He was always thinking, always immersed in some suryam, in some matter, in some idea. And therefore he always had a speech because he's always working through something. And if you're called to speak, that's what you say. Incidentally, this is my favorite story of my grandfather. There was one time in the yeshiva where he didn't have a speech prepared. I've said the story before, but I have to say it again because it's my favorite story. And it relates to this idea I'm trying to convey here. Every week, the Rosh Yeshiva in a yeshiva has a responsibility. He has to give the Shir Klali, which means the general lecture, the general discourse. And that's based upon the Talmud that they're studying in that week. He's responsible to give the lecture. And then the Mashgiach, the spiritual dean, he has to give the Musar Shmuz, he has to give the Musar lecture every week. This every week for years and decades, my grandfather would give a brand new lecture, a brand new discourse, and we have thousands upon thousands of them because he wrote them all down with German punctiliousness, wrote them down exactly, perfectly. We have notebooks, handwritten notebooks where he wrote hundreds of pages all by hand. Never once is there a word crossed out. Everything was so organized in his mind that he never had to cross things out. He just wrote it out and it was all perfect. So he did this thousands of times. But there was one week that no matter how hard he tried to prepare a lecture, he had nothing to say. And the clock is ticking because at 7 o'clock he has to go to the yeshiva and everyone's going to be sitting down waiting for his lecture and he has nothing to say. And 7 o'clock is around the corner. He has nothing to say. He doesn't know what to do. So he puts on his rabbinic hat and rabbinic frock coat and he walks to the yeshiva. He's in the hands of the Almighty now. And he gets to the yeshiva and something happens that never happened before and never happened afterwards. It's an unbelievable story. Never happened before, it never happened afterwards. The Rosh Yeshiva, his partner in leading the yeshiva, comes over to him and says, I have a very unusual request. My father-in-law's in town, and he really wants to speak to the yeshiva. Would it be okay if he takes over your pulpit, if he speaks in your stead? All of your talents is what the Almighty gives you to accomplish what he wants you to accomplish. And every once in a while, he'll just close those shutters and you don't know why. And it's to teach you a lesson that when the shutters are opened, when the well springs are flowing, that is not your handiwork. Of course, you have to put in your hard work, but that comes from God. Never happened before, never happened again. The only time he's completely tongue-tied, the man says, okay, I tied your tongue because today you don't need to speak, but next week when your tongue is untied, you should know where it comes from. Everything in life, the career path, the life steps that we take comes from the Almighty. Hamechin mitzadei gaver, we say in the morning blessings, we thank God who prepares the steps, the footfalls of man. The Almighty positions us to do what we need to do. But that does not absolve us of doing work. My grandfather was always immersed in work. I saw in one of his letters, the letter was dated the 13th day of the month of Av, so it's 4 days after Tisha B'Av. And typically when Tisha B'Av ends, that's when you have a 3-week vacation between the semesters in the yeshiva, the Bein Hazmanim. And he's writing a letter. He used to get tons of letters from yeshiva students and from rabbis all across the country, all across the world. And we, in fact, have published 2 volumes of his letters. But one of them, it says it's addressed to this person, 13th day of the month of Av. And he writes, he says, I know you sent me a letter 7 months ago. I'm telling you, there hasn't been a single day where I wasn't completely packed with work that I was able to write a response to you. So please forgive me for my tardy response because I've been so immersed with all the work I need to do. This is the first day in 7 months that I have time to sit down and respond to your letter. He told my brother, my oldest brother, Eli, who also founded a yeshiva, he said to him, they were very close. When my grandfather passed away, I was 18. But my older brother is, 10 years older than me. So he was very close to my grandfather. And he always told me, he says, when you want to go into the rabbinate, become a Rosh Yeshiva. It's way easier than becoming a Mashgiach. Why? Because the yeshiva cycle, it's a 5-year cycle where they go through like around 10 or 15 different books of Talmud. And the Rosh Yeshiva has to give a lecture every week on that particular part of Talmud. But once you do 5 years of preparing those lectures, every 5th year, you could just go back to your notes from 5 years ago. But if you're a mashgiach and every week you have to give a Musar lecture, you can't just take old stuff and recycle it. It's much easier to be Rosh Yeshiva. Just do that, to choose that career path. Don't make the same mistake I made. Now, the ironic part about this is that my brother, when he opened up a yeshiva, he took the position of the mashgiach, not the Rosh Yeshiva position. But again, for more than 50 years, every single week, a brand new lecture. His lectures weren't just a quick idea. They were developed ideas that he worked on for years sometimes. He would say that sometimes it took him 10 years to develop a lecture. One lecture. And of course, it doesn't mean that's the only thing you're working on, but it means that these ideas germinate within you and they develop and they percolate within you until you actually develop an idea and it's real. It's not just, you're not, parroting over some thought. You have filtered the idea within you. It's changed you. And now you want to show others how this idea can change them as well. So he worked really hard, but nevertheless, he never forgot that it all came from the Almighty. The Almighty positioned him to do what he was set out to do, and all of his success came from the Almighty. When he started his yeshiva, so he started yeshiva in 1948. Now, today, Israel is a first world country. Israel has like a higher GDP per capita than like England and France. It's a very rich country. 1948, it was a third world country. And they had shortages of everything. They didn't have their industries. They were under constant threat of destruction from their Arab neighbors. And there wasn't food in the yeshiva. They didn't have food. They didn't have money. They didn't have nothing. So things were so dire that there was actual starvation. This is after the war. Actual starvation in the yeshiva. And my grandfather says, how can I open it? How can I have such a yeshiva? How could I do that? So there's one story that I've told in the past. He went to the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish told him to start the yeshiva. Chazon Ish was the greatest rabbi of the generation. My grandfather was only 36 when he started his yeshiva. He was young. Actually, he was younger. He was 34. I guess I'm older than him now. That's scary. That is terrifying. So he was young, but the Chazon Ish, who was the greatest rabbi of the generation, says, you have to start this yeshiva. And then after a couple of months or a couple of years, he went to the Chazon Ish and says, I can't do it. I don't have any funds. I can't pay for bread for my students. How can I have a yeshiva? So the Chazon Ish says, come back to me next week. Next week he gave him an envelope. He says, I fundraised for you, which is just a shocking thing. In my Jewish history podcast where I spoke about the Chazon Ish, I told over this story, the greatest rabbi of the generation is fundraising for some young schnook, as they say, who opened the yeshiva. But I think sometime later he went to the Brisker Rav, Rav Velvel Brisk. I think that's who it was with. It might have been with the Chazon Ish as well. I don't remember the details of the story. And he said to him, things have gotten so bad. So he told him, when the Jewish people, when they split the sea, we know that we're going to celebrate the end of Pesach. We celebrate the splitting of the sea. The seventh day of Pesach coincides when the Jewish people were cornered by Pharaoh, jumped into the water, and the water split. But the water didn't split instantly. Nachshon was the first one to jump in. The waters arrived up to his nostrils. And then when he couldn't walk any further without drowning, that's when they split. And in fact, our sages tell us that it didn't split completely. It split gradually. So you had to constantly jump into your nostrils and then it split a little more. But there's this principle, the Almighty does miracles for us. But only once we've gone to the absolute nth degree, once the water is by your nostrils, that's when it splits. Only after you've exhausted all of the possible efforts that you can do, only then does the Almighty intervene and say, let me make a miracle for you. We have to believe in ourselves, because if the Almighty puts us in a position to do something really important, we should not feel like we're not qualified. Who are we to do it? We're not qualified. We're accepting that we're not qualified. You're not qualified. I'm not qualified. None of us are qualified. Nevertheless, if there's no one else to do it, if there's something that needs to be done, if there's an important mission of the Jewish people that needs to be undertaken, and you find yourself situated that you potentially can do it, that means the Almighty wants you to take a swing at it. And the way you do that, number one, you got to work really, really, really hard. Even though the Almighty, of course, is the reason for all of our successes, is the reason for all of our triumphs, nevertheless, we have to work really hard. It's only once the water is by our nostrils, only then does the waters split. This is some of my thoughts to share from my grandfather's life on the 17th anniversary of his passing. I remember that day very, very vividly. I even wrote about it in the introduction of my new book, Upon a 10-Stringed Harp, about the experience that I had with him on that Seder night. It was just me and him in the hospital. Somehow I ended up there. It was just me and him for the Seder night. And he gave me maybe it was the last blessing that he gave in his lifetime. He gave it to me at 3 a.m. It was a very difficult time. This is Israeli hospitals. There's 3 patients in one room, and his hearing aid was making noise, and the guy next door was going crazy. And it was really difficult because every position, he was in pain in all the positions. And at 3 a.m., I sat down on the floor and I said, Saba, which means grandfather, Grandpa, give me a bracha, give me a blessing. And he gave me a wonderful blessing, which I chronicled in the introduction to my new book. It's been 17 years. Just an incredible person, a wonderful inspiration. His books, I encourage anyone who reads Hebrew to read them voraciously like I do. But just someone who lived such a life, grew up in Germany. His family his mother was very observant, very righteous, but his father was not. And he found his way somehow to Poland, of all places, the backwaters of Poland, to the Great Mir Yeshiva. And someone, with these kinds of, inauspicious, inglorious beginnings became one of the great rabbis of the 20th century. I don't think that's a stretch to say. Of course, I'm biased. I would say he's the greatest rabbi of the 20th century. Of course, I would say that. But someone who legitimately was considered by the other great Torah sages as one of their peers, one of the great Torah sages of his time. When he passed away in 2005, there were 100,000 people that came to his funeral on Pesach. And his books are found in every Jewish library. And his students are found in many of the great yeshivos until today. Someone who had tremendous accomplishments, but notwithstanding the fact that, his accomplishments, when we try to compare our small, pitiful accomplishments, we're nothing. But this idea where you don't have to feel like you are qualified. You're not qualified. They might have positioned you to do it. You got to work really hard, and only after you work really hard, only then will you hit pay dirt. I think that format he exhibited in his life, and that's some lesson that we can take away. It's a day later. It's been a day since his 17th Yahrzeit. But my hope is that this idea you find helpful, useful, inspiring, informative. And my hope in the merit of this, may his soul be elevated, Rabbi Shlomo ben Moshe, and may we all take a page out of his book, maybe even quite literally by reading some of it, and may we be inspired by this great personality. As always, my address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.